Welcome back. In the last session, we explored why class is the most powerful social determinant of health. We have seen how class or socioeconomic status create cumulative conditions of social disadvantage to reduce both human well-being and opportunities. So it is paramount to note that class, though powerful, is still just one social determinant among others. So today we will talk about race. We will ask questions about the idea of race as such, as well as how race is related to socioeconomic status. So let's get started. We have seen that socioeconomic status is intimately linked to other social determinants, such as the environment, neighborhood quality of life, access to healthcare, education, lifestyle, respect, and self-determination. Today we will complicate the picture slightly by zeroing in on the relationship between race and socioeconomic status, and then return to some of the issues of justice we have talked about in previous sessions. But before we can go any further, it is important to define some concepts. So what is race? Well, the idea of race may seem intuitive, since it is almost ubiquitous in everyday discourse. But, as it turns out, race is itself a complicated idea. First, race is often distinguished from ethnicity. Now, ethnicity, according to the dictionary, is related to a person's national or cultural origin or tradition. Race, on the other hand, identifies people who either belong to the same family and descended from a common ancestor, or to groups who share distinct physical features or ethnicity, sometimes considered to encompass common biological or genetic characteristics. But when it comes to medicine, it can be argued that ethnicity is potentially more relevant than race, because a person's national origin and cultural heritage probably tells us more about the person than race, which we'll see actually tells us very little. As we have seen, different governments actually divide populations into different categories. The Canadian census, for instance, categorizes people along ethnic lines, right? So you would see categories like Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, and then it's subdivided into Italian, English, Chinese, East Indian, and so on. The United States, on the other hand, uses racial categories of, say, Black, Asian, American Indian, and white. So while both race and ethnicity can mean ancestry in the United States government, race has to do with the continent of origin primarily, and ethnicity mostly relates to a person's specific geographical, cultural, and linguistic affiliations. So you might wonder, why is there such a discrepancy, right, between how different governments categorize people? Well, the answer is that racial categories are in a lot of ways entirely arbitrary. As we have seen, from numerous studies done, that a very, very small percentage of genetic variations is accounted for by a person's tie to a particular continent of origin, right? In fact, there's more genetic variation that occurs within groups than among the different racial categories. In other words, there is more genetic variation between individuals than people who come from a particular continent. Race is, in other words, really socially constructed, right? Or a category of social convention that really has no scientific validity in itself. So let's take a look at some historical precedents of how people are grouped into different racial categories. So in 1735, a Swedish naturalist divided the world's population based on how different they look to him, right? And then as you can see, these four different categories are also attached to quite dubious observations about how people behave, right? And then in 1781, we see a fifth category, the Malay people, was added to four different racial categories. And we see the differences between how these two different people categorize the people of the world as reflected on the US Census between 1990 and 1997, as we will see. So in 2002, Rosenberg and colleagues collected DNA samples from 1,000 plus individuals from 52 different population groups. And then they asked the computer using an algorithm to analyze 377 microsatellites in the DNA. And depending on how many groups the computer is asked to divide these 1,000 plus individuals, you get varied results, right? So if you divide them into 4 groups, you get 4 different groupings. You get European, Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. And then the second group is Sub-Saharan Africa. 3, East Asian and Oceania, or 4, the Americas. But if you ask the computer to divide them into 6 groups, you get this, right? Number 1, Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and then Oceania is now a separate racial group, and then you have the Americas, and then another group called the Kalash, which is a tribal group in Pakistan. So you can see the results will vary depending on what you tell the computer to do. So scholars have pointed out many methodological problems with Rosenberg and colleagues' study, right? For instance, populations from many parts of the Middle East, Ethiopia and Somalia, were excluded because they were not considered geographically stable, right? And when the same experiment is repeated using a different criteria, such as the analysis of S&P, South Asian became an independent race, right? So, and then in addition to that, these racial categories that the computer generated also do not correspond to the racial categories that we typically associate with social convention, right? So as we have seen, the Middle East and South Asians were grouped together with Europeans by the algorithm. But if we're using conventional categories, say of Asians and white, then obviously these 2 groups wouldn't be grouped together. And it's also important to note that historically the meaning of racial categories also change, right? For instance, Irish immigrants were not considered white in the late 1800s. So you can see that as Senator Henry Lodge was arguing against Irish immigration, he says, quote, "Surely it is not too much to sift now the hordes that pour out of every European steamship, unsifted, uncounted, unchecked. The races that build up this country come in diminishing numbers," end quote. So similarly, in the 1920s, we also have historical documents of many students going to Harvard and NYU, for instance, protesting the presence of Jewish people among them, right? In order to keep, quote, white men's colleges white, right? So racial categories are themselves historically and socially contingent and malleable. So numerous studies relating race to birth weight, heart disease, and high blood pressure revealed that significant differences actually exist within racial groups, more so than between them sometimes. So for instance, while Black Americans considered as a homogeneous group may have a higher likelihood of dying from cardiovascular disease on average, but this number is actually is deceptive in a lot of ways because it hides the fact that some Black populations, such as those who are born in the Caribbean and the Northeast, actually have an equal or less mortality rate than whites who are born in the Northeast in New York, as you can see from this graph. So the same can be said of people of Hispanic ethnicity, as Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans all have varied age-adjusted death rates. But to say that race is socially constructed is not to suggest that race has no relevance in regards to health and well-being. Now, race may not be a scientific category, but people in societies do act on the basis that race is real. And many institutions are designed on the basis that race is real. So therefore, race still has real empirical and social consequences. As we can see from this chart, Sloan and colleagues tracked the death rate gap between Black and white men between the 1900s and 1914, and then between 1992 and 2006. What they found is that while death rate for both groups fell because of obviously better social institution and healthcare, the gap between the mortality gap between the races remained the same at about 18% or 17%. We can see from this chart that the same pattern is also repeated in terms of infant mortality rate, right? The infant mortality rate of babies born to Black mothers was 2 times greater than white babies. But since we already talked about how socioeconomic status impacts health, we should come to expect that educational attainment can also explain some of the disparities. In fact, we do see that. However, as we can see from this chart, this first chart, that if we look a little closely at education, we notice that there is a racial gap in educational attainment as well. The second graph shows that even at the same educational attainment, blacks consistently get paid less than other racial groups. So from the data, we can establish that race, low socioeconomic status, and reduced health are correlated, with lower socioeconomic status and reduced health having a causal relationship, as we have seen in the previous session. This chart shows that even after accounting for socioeconomic status, there remain some health disparities between blacks and whites. So this suggests that even if educational attainment were equalized, there would still be disparities in life expectancy that is related to these diseases, right? These four diseases stand out as being the culprit of disparity are hypertension, diabetes, HIV, and being a victim of homicide. So a study in 2011 showed that controlling for these diseases, controlling for them actually eliminates the disparity, right? And another study in 2005 found that black people reported higher levels of chronic conditions at all levels of socioeconomic status. So the gap is actually greatest at the highest level of socioeconomic status, which is very surprising. Colin and colleagues concluded in 2018 that blacks encounter actually a greater level of discrimination at higher levels of socioeconomic status. So let's take a quick look at black infant mortality as an example of how race intersects with socioeconomic status to create health disparities. Now, although infant mortality has plummeted since the 1950s, the gap between white and black infants actually increased from 1.6 times to 2.3 times. Now, the relevant data on infant death rate suggests that black infants die at a higher rate at normal birth weight, and black infants also have consistently higher rates of low birth weight and very low birth weight. So the situation is better when black mothers have a higher socioeconomic status, as the death rate of black infants at each birth weight class is nearly identical to that of white infants. But infants, even at a higher socioeconomic status, are still born with higher rates of low and very low birth rate, right? And thus contributing to higher mortality rate for black infants, even at higher socioeconomic status. Now, why is that? One of the hints come from Shaw and colleagues' study in 2018, which showed that soldiers who gave birth within 6 months of deployment had the preterm birth rate of 6.4, while those who were not on deployment during the pregnancy had the rate of 3.1%. Now, this study shows that psychological, physical, and environmental stressors can negatively impact pregnancy. Now, similarly, living in a segregated community and having a low socioeconomic status and being in a community with other people who have low socioeconomic status exposes mothers to psychological, environmental, and physical stressors. Now, using the data collected by the Implicit Association Test website, Orchard and Price in 2007 showed that, quote, counties with the highest level of racial prejudice also have the largest black-white gaps in adverse birth outcomes, end quote. So the gap between counties with the highest levels of prejudice has about 14% greater gap in black-white low birth rates. So what is called the Latina paradox is puzzling, precisely because Hispanic infants have the same infant mortality rate as that of white infants, despite being a minority population who experience both racial prejudice as well as low socioeconomic status and relatively less education. Now, it turns out that many people have postulated that this is largely due to the culture of immigrant Hispanic families, right, as well as the unique structure of their family life. which is why some people have suggested that as Hispanic women are acculturated, it is shown that the protective effect is actually eroded, right? So as Hispanic women are more assimilated into American culture, then the Latina paradox goes away. So from what we've seen so far, it seems clear that race has an independent relationship to health, and then some scholars such as Phelan and Link propose that racism is a fundamental cause of racial differences in socioeconomic status. And then socioeconomic status is a fundamental cause of inequalities in health and mortality. And thus, racism is a fundamental cause of racial differences in health and mortality independent of socioeconomic status. We have already seen the causal relationships or mechanisms that relate socioeconomic status to health. However, race also has a unique history in the United States. Now, in addition to the history of Jim Crow segregation, and as well as the widespread white supremacist terrorism, which happened between 1882 to 1968, Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, also furthered segregation by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, a policy that came to be known as redlining. Now, blacks were also denied many of the benefits of the New Deal, as well as the GI Bill, because of systemic racism. So 1.2 million black veterans from World War II were denied the opportunity to use their benefits, as many mortgage companies, housing developers, and schools explicitly just excluded black people. So the history of racial discrimination really has an overwhelming effect on the present, even if discrimination were to be completely eliminated now. But it's not. As we can see from these numerous studies, that there is still a strong correlation between race-based discrimination and cardiovascular conditions, to such an extent that we can see that many young African Americans already show evidence of vascular injury. So the environmental and neighborhood impact is also worsened by racial segregation. In 1997, a study showed that there's a strong association between the concentration of blacks within a neighborhood and the death rate in the neighborhood. The higher the percentage of blacks, the higher the death rate. And this is true for neighborhoods at all socioeconomic levels. This is because the more segregated the community, the more income inequality interacts with racial segregation in order to reduce what we call social capital. Now, as a result, according to a study in 2004, crime, violence, and disorder are often higher in segregated neighborhoods. So what is social capital? Well, social capital are those features of our social relationships, such as interpersonal trust, as well as norms and practices of reciprocity and mutual aid, which facilitate collective action and mutual benefit. When a neighborhood lacks social capital, then members of the community do not have the same level of trust and mutual concern as other kinds of neighborhoods. And we see from many studies that inequality lessens social capital for those who are on the bottom side of the socioeconomic status. So all of this points to the fact that black adults experience elevated allostatic load. Now, couple that with low socioeconomic status, black children and adults suffer an even worse health outcome. Now, this graph shows the causal mechanism that links racial identity to bad health. So segregated neighborhoods, therefore, limits access to education, has concentrated poverty, leads to elevated levels of chronic poverty, and then has weak infrastructures and low social capital, which exposes residents to higher levels of environmental toxins as well. So what are some of the ethical issues raised by health disparities based on race? Now, we talked about society as a system of social cooperation over time, and that theories of justice evaluate the basic structure of society to see if people are treated as free and equal citizens. So this means that we need to ask whether the benefits and burdens of cooperation are distributed equitably. So the basic structure includes, as we talked about, political, economic, and social institutions, things that make human cooperation possible. The assumption is that a person's life prospects are influenced not merely by a person's personal choices, but also by how institutions are structured, sometimes by sheer luck, sometimes by the action of other individuals. So the assumption is that a just institution then is structured in such a way that each person has a fair chance to flourish. And this is, again, related to the principle of equality of opportunity we talked about a few sessions ago. So we have seen that part of what it means to have a fair chance and to flourish is to have access to dimensions of well-being that includes health, respect, self-determination, reasoning, and attachment. However, as we have seen, race thus gets in the way for many people, not because of biological differences, but because of structural injustices. So what is racism? According to Tommie Shelby, racism is a kind of ideology. But what is an ideology? According to him, an ideology is a widely held set of associated beliefs and implicit judgments that misrepresent significant social realities and that function through this kind of distortion to bring about or perpetuate unjust social relations. Now, in the past, racism as an ideology could take the form of explicit beliefs about the inherent biological inferiority of non-white racial groups. But today, racism is more likely to be characterized by beliefs and implicit judgments about the cultural backwardness or behavioral pathology of non-white racial groups. Now, these beliefs and judgments are not merely privately held views. They have real social impacts. So they create practices, rules, and institutions that deny equal opportunity to certain groups based on their racial belongings. So let's take a look at how racism may function in society. Because the ideology of racism can operate in institutional contexts where the relevant agents do not really consciously hold or openly express racist attitudes, it is important to recognize what is called institutional racism. There are two different kinds of institutional racism: extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic institutional racism, according to Tommie Shelby, it occurs when an institution employs policy that is race neutral in its content and public rationale, but nevertheless has significant or disproportionate negative impact on an unfairly disadvantaged racial group. One example would be racial profiling, which can cause a group to be stigmatized. Another example would be what is called reaction qualifications in hiring practices. It means that employers are afraid to, say, hire a black person because of how it may negatively impact the business because of the prejudice of the customers. Even though the employer may not be himself a racist, his hiring practices is based on racism. Intrinsic institutional racism, on the other hand, is associated with the constitutive features of institutions rather than merely their external effects or consequences. So the stated or implicit goal of the institution may serve racist goals, right? So the content of the institution's rules and practices may also contain racial biases, or that good rules can sometimes also be misapplied in a racist way. So a good example of a law that defends against both extrinsic and intrinsic institutional racism is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which enables people to sue an employer who relies on policies that, while perhaps not designed to discriminate, but in fact have a disproportionate adverse effect on disadvantaged racial minorities. So the law defends against both intrinsic and extrinsic institutional racism by outlawing both racist goals as well as consequences. So we have seen that multiple institutions can also combine to create cascading effects of racism and have an adverse health impact on people who are discriminated against. So for example, a black man may face discrimination during a job search, even with a great education. However, if his education is also subpar because of institutional racism in education, then his opportunity to advance is undermined by multiple institutions, in this case, both by institutional racism in education and in the job search process. Another important term is structural racism. For Tommie Shelby, structural racism refers to a society's failure to rectify the effects of past injustices. As we have seen, some of these past injustices are housing discrimination and segregation and so on, which created the segregated neighborhoods that we have. So, and then two, structural racism refers to laissez-faire racism that blames disadvantaged individuals without accounting for unjust social structures, which only leaves unjust institutions as they are. So discrimination is not wrong in itself, right? In a previous session, we talked about the distinction between appraisal and recognition respect. However, as we said before, discrimination on the basis of appraisal is not wrong. So what is unethical about discrimination? Many ways of discriminating are no doubt morally neutral or morally justified or morally required even. So why is discrimination based on race wrong? So let's take a look at a few perspectives. It is important to know the difference between a justifiable discrimination versus a morally wrong discrimination. And I think this allows us to understand color blindness as well as its limitations. So what is color blindness? Well, color blindness basically holds that race should never be a consideration when it comes to institutional policies and laws. But what are some issues with that? Well, we have seen that though not scientifically valid, race has very real social consequences. So color blindness confuses really two different kinds of discrimination. Number one, a morally problematic kind of discrimination is you discriminate against someone because she is considered a racial inferior. This is different from treating the same person differently because other people have wronged her, or because that person has been considered as a racial inferior in order to correct the situation. So structural racism, as we have seen, really leads to reduced opportunity and well-being. So one of the jobs of corrective justice then is to make up for that loss of opportunity and health. So discrimination is wrong only when it violates equal respect. So for example, when someone is denied an opportunity because of his race, or because his race is considered to be inferior, or when rules and policies cause a particular racial group to experience disproportionate disadvantage. Now these would be considered wrongful discrimination. So here the concern of justice is not merely with absolute poverty. It is concerned primarily with relative inequality of opportunity. This means that structures that lead to unfair distributions of opportunity should be challenged and corrected. Even if poverty is eliminated, for instance, if unjust social structures continue to exist that lead to unequal distributions of opportunities, then the institution still needs to be criticized from a moral point of view. So inequality is not considered, again, wrong in itself, right? But wrong insofar as it undermined some person or group's chance to flourish as an equal member of society. So equal opportunity does not only entail the absence of outright discrimination, but also the removal of obstacles to human well-being and flourishing as well. So according to this account of justice, apart from the history of discrimination, mistreatment, as well as intimidation that has led to segregated neighborhoods, Black segregation is wrong not because Blacks are numerically overrepresented in certain neighborhoods, right? Not because of how many Black people there are in the neighborhood, but because where Blacks tend to be overrepresented, namely in deeply deprived neighborhoods. In other words, segregation is problematic because of the concentrated poverty as well as the concentrated disadvantage that are present in segregated Black neighborhoods. So when concentrated poverty is combined with concentration of disadvantage, this leads to further racism and stigmatization of Black people, even for those who do not live in segregated or deprived neighborhoods. Now, this stigmatization is due to the cultural association of Black people with negative stereotypes such as being lazy, criminal, violent, irresponsible, and imprudent. So this stigmatization then further reduces and undermines respect and self-determination as well as future job opportunities. So these are all examples where when multiple institutional factors combine to create a cascading effect on a particular population to undermine their human well-being and health. So that is all I have for you today. Hopefully this session provided some important concepts and ideas with which we can ethically evaluate the relationship between race and human well-being in our society. See you soon.